After 3 years of true love, my husband betrayed me. You know how she is? She forgets we talked about these things." The words landed softly, wrapped in laughter. Graham smiled as he said it, his hand resting casually on the dinner table, his tone light and affectionate, as though he were sharing an inside joke about a beloved, slightly forgetful pet. The guests around the table chuckled politely. Someone murmured something sympathetic. The conversation moved on, and Peaches sat perfectly still, her wineglass halfway to her lips, her face composed, her silence absolute. She had not forgotten. There had been no conversation. Graham had decided alone to renovate their house, and this, right now in front of his business partner Richard and 3 other couples, was the first she was hearing about it. But Peaches did not correct him. She set her glass down gently, smoothed the napkin on her lap, and let the moment pass. To anyone watching, she looked serene, unbothered. Maybe Graham was right. Maybe she had forgotten. But inside, something shifted. A small cold click, like a lock turning. Because Peaches had not forgotten a single thing in 3 years. She had been quiet, yes. Patient, yes. But never, not once, had she stopped paying attention. And tonight, as Graham laughed and his guests nodded and the lie settled into the air like truth, Peaches made a decision. She was done staying silent to keep the peace. She was going to stay silent to gather every piece of evidence she needed. And when she finally spoke, it would be with a clarity that could not be dismissed, minimized, or rewritten. Graham had mistaken her quietness for absence of mind. He had no idea what was coming. Peaches Coleman had always been the kind of person who believed that love required compromise. Not the dramatic, sacrificial kind that makes for good stories, but the small, everyday kind. Adjusting your tone to avoid an argument, letting someone else choose the restaurant, nodding along when your opinion is gently corrected in front of others. Her mother had been a peacekeeper. Her father had been a man whose feelings were always more urgent, more justified, more worthy of accommodation than anyone else's. And Peaches had learned early that the women in her family were the ones who absorbed tension, who translated conflict into calm, who made everyone else's life easier by asking for less. So when she met Graham, she did not see the warning signs. She saw a man who knew what he wanted. A man who made decisions quickly and confidently, who did not drown in indecision the way she sometimes did. In the beginning, it felt like relief. She had spent so much of her 20s second-guessing herself, and here was someone who seemed certain about everything, including her. Graham was a real estate developer, successful and charming, the kind of man who commanded a room without raising his voice. He had opinions about wine, about art, about which neighborhoods were worth investing in and which were already past their prime. Peaches, who worked as a grant writer for nonprofit organizations, found his confidence attractive. She thought it would balance her. She did not realize at first that balance was not what Graham wanted. What he wanted was someone who would not require management. Someone who would fit neatly into the life he was building without asking him to adjust the blueprint. And for 3 years, Peaches had done exactly that. The erasure had been so gradual that Peaches could not pinpoint when it started. Maybe it was always there, woven into the foundation of their relationship, visible only now that she had stopped pretending not to see it. Graham had a way of rewriting reality that was so subtle, so confident, that even Peaches sometimes questioned her own memory. He would tell a story at a dinner party about a decision they had made, and Peaches would sit there smiling politely, knowing she had never been part of that conversation. But if she brought it up later, he would look confused, even hurt. "We talked about this," he would say, his voice patient, as though she were the one misremembering. "You said you were fine with it." And Peaches, who did not want to be the kind of wife who kept score, who made everything difficult, would let it go. At professional events, Graham introduced her as "my wife, Peaches," without ever mentioning what she did, who she was beyond her relationship to him. If someone asked, he would answer for her, summarizing her work in a way that made it sound smaller, simpler, less important than it was. "She writes grants for nonprofits," he would say, with a tone that suggested charity work, hobbyist-level involvement, something she did to stay busy. Peaches, who had secured millions of dollars in funding for literacy programs, housing initiatives, and community health projects, would smile and nod. Because correcting him publicly felt petty. It felt like she was the one making things awkward. So she stayed quiet. And Graham, emboldened by her silence, grew more careless with the truth. There was a night, about 8 months into their marriage, when Peaches realized how thoroughly she had been erased. They were at a charity gala, one Peaches had helped organize. She had written the grant application that secured the funding for the evening's honored program, a youth mentorship initiative that had just won a regional award. It was her work, her research, her words, her careful construction of narrative and need that had convinced the foundation to invest. But when the director of the organization thanked the supporters publicly, Graham stood and accepted the applause as though he had been part of the effort. Afterward, at the cocktail reception, someone congratulated him. "You two must be so proud," the woman said, smiling warmly at them both. "It's wonderful when couples can collaborate on something so meaningful." Graham nodded graciously. "We're just glad we could help." Peaches felt the word like a hand pressed over her mouth. She had done the work. Graham had done nothing. He had not read a single draft, attended a single meeting, contributed a single idea. But now, standing in a room full of people who respected him, he was claiming co-ownership of her achievement. And Peaches, again, said nothing. Because, what would she say? Actually, he wasn't involved at all? That would make her look petty, territorial, unable to share credit with her own husband. So she smiled. She let the moment pass. But later that night, sitting alone in their bedroom while Graham took a phone call in the other room, Peaches opened her laptop and created a new folder. She titled it simply, "Record," and she wrote down the date, the event, and what had happened. Not because she knew what she would do with it, but because some part of her, some part that had not yet been trained into silence, understood that truth mattered, even if no one else was listening. Especially if no one else was listening. Graham's mother, Helen, had never liked Peaches. It was not overt. Helen was too socially graceful for that. But there was always a coolness in her interactions with Peaches, a subtle implication that her son had settled, that he could have done better. Helen had a way of framing everything Peaches did as either inadequate or lucky. If Peaches cooked a nice dinner, Helen would say, "Well, isn't that sweet?" in a tone that suggested she was surprised Peaches had managed it. If Graham accomplished something professionally, Helen would say to Peaches, "You must be so proud of him," as though Peaches' only role was to admire from the sidelines. And when Peaches, in a rare moment of vulnerability, tried to tell Helen that she sometimes felt overlooked in her marriage, Helen had smiled indulgently and said, "Marriage is about compromise, dear. You can't expect Graham to cater to your feelings all the time. He has a very demanding career." As though Peaches did not also work. As though her feelings were an indulgence, not a legitimate need. Peaches had left that conversation feeling smaller, ashamed for even bringing it up. And she had not tried again. Helen reinforced Graham's narrative at every turn, that he was patient, that he was generous, that Peaches was lucky to have a husband who tolerated her sensitivity. And Peaches, who had been raised to respect her elders and avoid conflict, absorbed the message. She was the problem. She was too sensitive. She needed to try harder. So she did. The first time Peaches noticed something was wrong, really wrong, not just the ambient wrongness of feeling invisible, was on a Thursday evening in late September. Graham had said he would be home by 7. He had a client meeting that afternoon, nothing unusual. But 7 came and went. Then 8. Then 9. Peaches texted him, "Everything okay?" He responded an hour later, "Sorry, meeting ran late. Heading home now." When he walked in just before 11, Peaches was in the living room, a book open on her lap, though she had not read a single page. "Long meeting," she said, keeping her tone light, not accusatory. Graham shrugged, setting his keys on the counter. "You know how it is." Client wanted to keep talking. He moved past her toward the bedroom, already pulling his tie loose. Peaches stayed on the couch, her book still open, her mind quietly cataloging details. The meeting had been scheduled for 3 o'clock. Even a long meeting would not run 8 hours. Graham's shirt smelled faintly of perfume, not hers. And when she checked their shared credit card account later that night, something she did occasionally, not out of suspicion but out of practical budgeting, there was a charge from a restaurant she had never heard of, in a part of the city Graham had no business being in. She did not confront him. Instead, she opened her laptop, navigated to the folder titled Record, and wrote it all down. Date, time, the restaurant, the charge, the smell of perfume. Not proof, not yet, but a data point. And Peaches, who had spent years learning how to build an argument from scattered evidence, understood that data points, when accumulated, became patterns, and patterns became proof. Graham's carelessness grew in direct proportion to Peaches' silence. He started coming home late more often. He stopped offering explanations unless Peaches asked, and even then his answers were vague, delivered with a faint edge of irritation, as though her questions were invasive. He began taking phone calls in other rooms, lowering his voice when she walked by. He started talking about work trips that had not been mentioned before, last-minute obligations that required him to be gone for the weekend. And Peaches, still quiet, still watching, said nothing. Because she understood something Graham did not, silence was not the same as ignorance. Graham thought Peaches was not noticing because she was not reacting. He thought her lack of confrontation meant she was either too trusting or too naive to see what was happening. But Peaches was noticing everything. She noticed the way he tilted his phone screen away from her when a notification came through. She noticed that his client dinners never appeared on his work calendar, which she had access to for coordinating their personal schedule. She noticed that he had started going to the gym more often, buying new clothes, wearing cologne on days he claimed to be going directly to the office. She noticed, and she documented, every late night, every unexplained charge, every inconsistency between what he said and what his schedule, his receipts, his behavior suggested. Peaches was not falling apart. She was building a case. And she was very, very good at building cases. Her work as a grant writer had trained her for this, though she had not realized it at the time. Writing a successful grant application required more than passion or good intentions. It required evidence, data, a clear, logical argument supported by documentation that could withstand scrutiny. You had to anticipate objections, address weaknesses, and present your case so thoroughly that the funder had no reason to doubt you. Peaches had written hundreds of applications. She knew how to find the story in the numbers, how to make the invisible visible, how to construct a narrative that was both emotionally compelling and factually unassailable. And now, she was applying those same skills to her marriage. She pulled phone records from their shared account. She cross-referenced Graham's calendar with his credit card charges. She checked the mileage on his car against the distances he claimed to have driven. She did not do this with anger, or even sadness. She did it with the same calm focus she brought to her professional work. Because if she was going to speak, when she was going to speak, she needed to be sure. She needed evidence that could not be dismissed as paranoia, misunderstanding, or wifely hysteria. She needed the truth to be undeniable. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Peaches saw the text message. Graham had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. It was face up, and when a notification came through, the preview lit up the screen. Peaches was not in the habit of reading his messages. But the screen was right there, visible, impossible to ignore. The name was Courtney. The message read, "Missing you already. Last night was perfect." Peaches stood very still, her hand frozen halfway to the coffee pot. She did not pick up the phone. She did not unlock it. She simply stood there, reading the words over and over until they blurred. Last night was perfect. Last night, Graham had told Peaches he was at a work dinner. He had come home after midnight, smelling of wine and something floral, and had gone straight to bed without saying a word. Peaches had lain awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, already knowing but not yet ready to name what she knew. Now, standing in her kitchen, looking at a text message from a woman whose name she did not recognize, Peaches felt the last thread of doubt snap. This was not paranoia. This was not insecurity. This was betrayal. And it had been happening for a long time. Peaches did not cry. She did not throw the phone, did not scream, did not confront Graham the moment he stepped out of the shower. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened her laptop. She navigated to the record folder and created a new document. Courtney. She did not know who Courtney was yet, but she would find out. Because Peaches had learned, over 3 years of being dismissed and erased and talked over, that knowledge was power. And the person who controlled the information controlled the narrative. Graham thought he was in control because Peaches was quiet. But Peaches was not quiet because she was weak. She was quiet because she was gathering everything she needed to reclaim her own story. And when she was ready, when she had every piece of evidence documented, cross-referenced and verified, she would speak, not in anger, not in tears, but with a clarity that would leave no room for Graham to lie, to minimize, to rewrite what had happened. Peaches took a sip of her coffee, her hands steady, her mind already moving through the next steps. She would find out who Courtney was. She would map the timeline of the affair. She would pull every receipt, every message, every piece of evidence that proved what Graham had been doing. And then, when the moment was right, she would stop being silent, not because she wanted revenge, but because she refused to let someone else define her reality. Graham had erased her for 3 years. It was time for Peaches to write herself back in. Finding out who Courtney was took Peaches less than 2 hours. She started with social media, searching the name alongside Graham's industry keywords: commercial real estate, marketing, development. Within minutes, she found her. Courtney Brennan, late 20s, polished, professionally attractive in the way that suggested expensive hair appointments and a gym membership she actually used. Her profile was public. Peaches scrolled through it with the same detached focus she brought to research for grant applications. Courtney worked for a marketing firm that specialized in commercial real estate branding. She had attended the same industry conference Graham had gone to 6 months ago. The timeline aligned. Peaches cross-referenced Courtney's location tags with Graham's credit card charges. A wine bar downtown on a Tuesday evening when Graham had claimed to be in a budget meeting. A boutique hotel near the waterfront on a weekend he said he was visiting a construction site out of town. A restaurant Peaches had never heard of, the same one from that late September night, appearing again and again in both the charges and Courtney's carefully curated photographs of beautifully plated food. Courtney never tagged Graham. She was careful. But she was not careful enough. Because Peaches knew how to read gaps. She knew how to notice what was missing from a narrative. And what was missing from Courtney's social media was any mention of a partner, any romantic context, even as she posted photographs from locations and times that matched exactly with Graham's unexplained absences. Peaches saved screenshots. She noted dates. She built a timeline in a spreadsheet, color-coded and cross-referenced. And she felt nothing. Not yet. There would be time for feelings later. Right now, there was only the work. The careful, methodical work of making the invisible visible. Peaches had always been good at this. At seeing the shape of a story beneath the surface. At understanding what needed to be documented and what could be inferred. At building an argument so airtight that no one could dismiss it. She was doing it now. Not for a foundation or a nonprofit board, but for herself. Because when she finally spoke, she needed Graham to understand that she had not been blind. She had been strategic. And there was a difference. Over the next 2 weeks, Peaches pulled their shared phone records. She did not need to hack or sneak. They were on a joint account. She had every legal right to access them. And there, in the call logs and text timestamps, was a pattern so obvious she wondered how Graham had ever thought he could hide it. Calls to Courtney's number, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. Texts sent late at night, early in the morning, during hours when Graham was supposedly focused on work. The volume of communication alone told the story. This was not a professional relationship. This was not casual. This was an affair. And it had been going on for at least 6 months. Possibly longer. Peaches printed the records. She filed them in a folder, organized by date. She added the credit card statements, the screenshots, the timeline. Everything was labeled, indexed, prepared as though she were submitting it to a review board. Because in a way, she was. Graham was not in the shower anymore, washing off evidence. He was in the living room, watching a game on television, relaxed and unsuspecting. He had no idea that in the next room, his wife was compiling a case against him with the precision of a prosecutor. He had no idea that his carelessness was about to cost him everything. The boundary that should never have been crossed was not the affair itself, though that was devastating enough. It was what came next. Graham started asking Peaches to lie for him. It began small. A request to tell his mother he had been working late when he had not. A casual mention that if Richard called, Peaches should say Graham was out of town on business. Just small favors, delivered with the easy confidence of someone who assumed compliance. And Peaches, still operating in silence, still gathering evidence, said yes. She covered for him. She confirmed his lies to Helen. She told Richard that Graham was unavailable when he called. She played the role of the supportive, unsuspecting wife. But every time she did, something inside her hardened. because Graham was not just betraying her. He was making her complicit in her own erasure. He was using her as a tool to construct the very lies that were destroying their marriage. And that was the line. The one that once crossed could not be uncrossed. Peaches could forgive being lied to. She could even possibly forgive the affair if Graham had come to her with honesty, with remorse, with a willingness to face what he had done. But asking her to help him deceive others, to become an accessory to his dishonesty, to use her own voice to corroborate his false narrative. That was different. That was not just betrayal. That was contempt. It meant Graham believed Peaches was so thoroughly under his control that she would participate in her own humiliation without question. And in that moment, something in Peaches shifted from hurt to resolve. She was not going to leave quietly. She was not going to disappear into some post-divorce obscurity while Graham rewrote their history to make himself the victim. She was going to reclaim the narrative. Publicly. Undeniably. And she was going to do it with evidence that could not be argued away. The cracks in Graham's facade started to show in public before Peaches said a word. She was at a networking event for nonprofit professionals, the kind of gathering she used to attend regularly before Graham made her feel like her work did not matter enough to prioritize. She had decided to go, not because she expected anything from it, but because staying home felt like surrendering more ground. Jenna was there. They had worked together years ago, before Peaches had met Graham. Jenna was warm, sharp, the kind of person who asked real questions and actually listened to the answers. They were talking near the refreshments table when Jenna paused mid-sentence, her expression shifting. "I saw Graham the other night," Jenna said. "At that new place downtown. The one with the rooftop bar." Peaches kept her face neutral. She took a sip of water. "When?" "Last Thursday, I think," Jenna said. "He was with a woman. I assumed it was a client or a colleague." She paused, her discomfort visible. "It was a client, right?" Peaches smiled. A small, controlled smile that gave nothing away. "Probably." Jenna's eyes searched her face, looking for reassurance, for confirmation that everything was fine. But Peaches did not offer it. She simply changed the subject, and after a moment, Jenna let her. But the seed had been planted. Jenna had seen something. And Jenna, who was not stupid, had noticed that Peaches did not seem surprised. Later that week, Richard mentioned something in passing to Graham, something about a meeting Graham had supposedly attended. Graham brushed it off, said Richard must have misremembered. But Peaches, who was standing nearby, knew that Graham had told her he was somewhere else entirely that day. The lies were stacking up. They were becoming too complex, too contradictory. Graham was juggling too many versions of the truth, and he was starting to drop them. And people were starting to notice. Peaches did not say anything. She did not need to. She just watched as the inconsistencies accumulated, as the people in Graham's life began to exchange glances, to hesitate before accepting his explanations. The narrative was cracking, and Peaches had not lifted a finger. She just had to wait. She discovered the full scope of the affair on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late October. Graham used their shared email account for travel rewards points. He did not think about it. Why would he? Peaches never checked his email. She had no reason to. She trusted him. Or she had. But now, searching for a receipt she needed for tax purposes, Peaches opened the account and saw a confirmation email for a hotel booking. A weekend reservation at a boutique property 2 hours outside the city, this coming weekend. The reservation was under Graham's name. For 2 guests. Peaches stared at the screen, her heart beating slow and heavy in her chest. This coming weekend, Graham had told her he was going to a construction site visit. Solo. He would be gone Saturday and Sunday. Back late Sunday night. But this email told a different story. Peaches clicked through to the booking details. A king suite. Champagne package included. Late checkout requested. This was not a work trip. This was a romantic getaway. She opened another folder in the email archive, searching for previous confirmations. And there they were. Hotel bookings going back 5 months. Weekend trips. Overnight stays. All times when Graham had told Peaches he was traveling for work. He had been lying the entire time. Not just about Courtney. Not just about a few late nights. But about entire weekends. Entire trips. He had constructed an alternate version of his life, and Peaches had not been part of it. She sat back in her chair staring at the screen and felt the last fragile hope that this might be a misunderstanding finally shatter. This was not a mistake. This was not a moment of weakness. This was a sustained, deliberate deception. Planned, executed, hidden. And Peaches had been funding it. Their joint account had paid for those hotel rooms. Her money, earned through hours of careful work, had paid for Graham's betrayal. She printed every confirmation. She saved every email. She added them to the folder, which was now thick with evidence, organized and undeniable. And then she closed the laptop and sat in the silence of her kitchen, listening to the rain against the windows, and let herself feel it. The grief, the anger, the deep, aching sense of having been erased so completely that Graham had not even bothered to cover his tracks well. He had not thought he needed to. Because Peaches was quiet. Because Peaches did not make waves. Because Peaches, in 3 years of marriage, had never once challenged him in a way that mattered. He had mistaken her silence for blindness. And that mistake was going to cost him everything. But Peaches did not act yet. Not yet. Because there was one more thing she needed to understand. She needed to know what Graham had been telling people about their marriage. What narrative he had been constructing to justify what he was doing. And she found out 3 days later, entirely by accident. She was picking up dry cleaning, Graham's suits along with a few of her own things. The woman behind the counter, someone Peaches had seen a dozen times but never really spoken to, smiled sympathetically as she handed over the clothes. "I hope things get easier for you," the woman said. Peaches blinked. "I'm sorry." The woman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Your husband mentioned you've been going through a tough time. I just wanted to say I hope you feel better soon." Peaches stood very still, the hangers heavy in her hand. "He said that." The woman nodded. "A few weeks ago. He seemed really worried about you." Peaches forced a smile. "That's kind of you. Thank you." She walked out to her car, loaded the dry cleaning into the back seat, and sat behind the wheel, staring at nothing. Graham had been telling people she was struggling, that she was going through something. He was planting seeds, building a narrative in which Peaches was unstable, fragile, unreliable. He was preemptively discrediting her, so that if she ever did speak up, if she ever did accuse him, people would already doubt her. They would think she was imagining things, overreacting, unable to handle reality. Graham was not just having an affair. He was rewriting their entire marriage to protect himself from the consequences. He was erasing her. Not just privately but publicly. He was turning her into an unreliable narrator of her own life. And that was the moment Peaches decided she was done waiting. She had enough evidence. She had enough documentation. She had a timeline, a paper trail, and witnesses who had seen inconsistencies even if they had not named them yet. She had everything she needed. Now she just had to choose the moment. Graham gave her that moment himself. He decided to host a dinner party. At their home, with Richard, his business partner, and 2 other couples from their social circle. People who respected Graham, who saw him as successful and charming, who had always treated Peaches as a pleasant but unremarkable accessory to his life. Graham told Peaches about the dinner 3 days before, not asking if she was comfortable with it, just informing her. He needed to strengthen some professional relationships. It would be good for business. She did not mind, did she? Peaches said she did not mind. And she did not. Because this dinner party was going to be useful. She prepared for it the way she prepared for everything now, with calm, deliberate focus. She cooked. She set the table. She played the role of the gracious hostess, smiling and welcoming as the guests arrived. And throughout the evening she watched Graham perform. He was in his element. Confident, charming, holding court at the head of the table. He told stories, made people laugh, positioned himself as the center of every conversation. And then, halfway through dinner, he told a story about an argument he and Peaches had last week. Except the story was not true. Graham described Peaches as irrational, insisting they had made plans they had not made, getting upset over a miscommunication that had never happened. He framed himself as patient, understanding, doing his best to manage her confusion. The guests laughed uncomfortably. Someone made a sympathetic comment. And Graham, emboldened, turned to Peaches with a smile that was meant to look affectionate but landed as condescending. "You're remembering it wrong again, sweetheart." The table went quiet. Not silent, but quieter. The kind of quiet that happens when people sense they are witnessing something uncomfortable, but are not sure whether to acknowledge it. Peaches looked at Graham. She did not smile. She did not laugh. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable, and took a sip of her wine. And in that moment, she decided. Tonight? After the guests left, tonight, the silence would end. The dinner party ended just after 10. The guests thanked Peaches for the meal, complimented the house, and left in a flurry of polite goodbyes. Graham closed the door behind the last couple and turned to Peaches with a satisfied smile. "That went well," he said. Peaches was clearing plates from the table, stacking them with calm efficiency. She did not look at him. It did. Graham moved into the living room, loosening his tie, already relaxed, already moving on. Peaches finished loading the dishwasher, wiped down the counters, and then walked into the living room where Graham was scrolling through his phone, half watching something on television. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. He looked so comfortable, so certain that everything was fine, that his life was exactly as he had constructed it. Peaches took a breath. "Do you want to tell me about Courtney?" The effect was immediate. Graham's head snapped up, his expression shifting from confusion to shock, to something like fear in the span of a heartbeat. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then tried to recover. "What are you talking about?" he said, but his voice was wrong. Too high, too defensive. Peaches did not move from the doorway. She kept her tone even, almost conversational. "Courtney Brennan, the woman you've been seeing for the last 6 months. Do you want to tell me about her, or should I just keep going?" Graham stood up, his phone forgotten on the couch. "Peaches, I don't know what you think is happening, but you're confused." Peaches almost laughed. It was such a predictable response. Deny, deflect, make her doubt herself. But she was done doubting herself. "I'm not confused," she said. "I know about the hotels. I know about the restaurants. I know about the weekend trips that were never work trips. I have the credit card statements, the phone records, the emails. I have all of it, Graham." His face changed. The defensiveness flickered, replaced by something sharper. Anger, maybe. Or panic. "You went through my phone," he said, his voice rising. "You invaded my privacy." Peaches shook her head slowly. "I didn't need to go through your phone. You've been using our shared email, our shared credit card, our shared phone plan. Everything I found, I had every legal right to access. You weren't hiding it, Graham. You just assumed I wasn't paying attention." He stared at her, and for the first time in 3 years, Peaches saw something like uncertainty in his eyes. Graham tried a different tactic. His voice softened. He took a step toward her. "Peaches, if something happened, if I made a mistake, we can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can fix it." Peaches held up a hand, stopping him. Don't what?" he said, his tone pleading now. "Don't pretend this was a mistake," Peaches said. "Don't pretend this was one bad decision. You've been lying to me for 6 months. You've been taking trips with her. You've been building a whole separate life. And worse than that, you've been telling people I'm unstable, that I'm struggling. You've been rewriting our marriage to make me the problem so that when this came out, no one would believe me." Graham's face went pale. "I never said that." "You told the woman at the dry cleaners I was going through a tough time," Peaches said. "You told your mother I've been unhappy. You've been planting the narrative, Graham. You've been preemptively discrediting me. And you asked me to lie for you, to cover for you, to help you deceive your own business partner and your own mother." She took a breath, her voice steady, her hands unclenched at her sides. "You didn't just betray me. You tried to make me complicit in my own erasure." Graham was shaking his head, his hands raised as though trying to physically push her words away. "You're overreacting. This isn't what you think. You're blowing this out of proportion." And there it was. The line Peaches had known was coming. She looked at him, this man she had loved, this man she had spent 3 years trying to please, trying to support, trying to be enough for. And she felt nothing but clarity. "I'm not overreacting," she said quietly. "I'm done being edited out of my own life." She turned and walked to the closet, pulled out the overnight bag she had packed earlier that day, and slung it over her shoulder. Graham followed her, his voice rising. "Where are you going?" "Peaches, you can't just leave. We need to talk about this." She stopped at the door and looked back at him. "We'll talk when I'm ready, not before." "Peaches, please." But she was already walking out, the door closing softly behind her, the cool night air hitting her face like a baptism. and for the first time in 3 years, Peaches felt like she could breathe. Peaches stayed with Jenna for 3 days. She did not tell Jenna everything at first. Just that she and Graham were having problems, that she needed space, that she would explain more when she was ready. Jenna, to her credit, did not push. She set up the guest room, made coffee in the mornings, and gave Peaches the quiet she needed to think. And Peaches did think. She sat in Jenna's guest room with her laptop and her folder of evidence, and mapped out what came next. Because leaving Graham was not the end of this. It was only the beginning. Graham was already moving, already trying to control the narrative. Peaches knew him well enough to predict it. He would be calling people right now. His mother, Richard, their mutual friends. He would be framing the separation as Peaches going through something, as her being irrational, as him being blindsided by her sudden departure. He would position himself as the victim before Peaches ever had a chance to speak, unless she moved first. Peaches opened her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She thought about who mattered, who had influence in Graham's world, who would actually listen if she presented them with facts instead of emotion. Richard's name sat at the top of the list. Graham's business partner, the man who had co-signed loans with Graham, who trusted him with financial decisions, who had built a company alongside him. If anyone needed to know the truth about Graham's character, it was Richard. But Peaches did not call him, not yet. Because timing mattered. Approach too soon, and it would look like she was lashing out, trying to poison Graham's professional relationships out of spite. Approach too late, and Graham's version of events would already be set in stone. She needed to wait for the right moment. The moment when her credibility would be at its highest and Graham's would be starting to crack. So Peaches waited. And while she waited, she made herself visible. There was a nonprofit fundraiser that Friday evening, an event Peaches had been invited to months ago, back when she still attended these things regularly. She had RSVP'd yes before everything with Graham had fallen apart, and now she decided she would go. Not to hide, not to avoid the people who knew Graham, but to show them exactly who she was when she was not standing in his shadow. She chose her outfit carefully. Professional, elegant. Nothing that screamed emotional crisis or instability. She did her hair and makeup with the same attention to detail she brought to everything else. And when she walked into the venue, she walked in alone, head up, shoulders back, calm. People noticed. Several colleagues she had not seen in months approached her, surprised and pleased to see her. They asked about her work, about the projects she was currently managing, about her life, and Peaches answered honestly, warmly. Without once mentioning Graham or the separation, she was not performing. She was simply being herself. The version of herself that had existed before Graham, the version that had slowly disappeared over 3 years of marriage, was walking back into the room. And people responded to it. Halfway through the evening, Peaches saw someone she recognized from Graham's professional circle. A woman named Angela, married to one of Richard's associates. Angela had been at the dinner party a week ago. She had been there when Graham publicly questioned Peaches' memory, when he framed her as confused and irrational. Angela approached cautiously, her expression uncertain. "Peaches, hi. I didn't expect to see you here." Peaches smiled. "It's good to see you, Angela." Angela hesitated, clearly trying to decide whether to ask the question she wanted to ask. Is everything okay? Graham mentioned you were going through something." There it was. Exactly what Peaches had expected. Graham's narrative, already circulating. Peaches kept her tone light, unbothered. "I'm doing well, actually. Thank you for asking." Angela blinked, visibly confused. The Peaches standing in front of her, composed and articulate and clearly fine, did not match the version Graham had described. "Oh," Angela said slowly. "That's good. I'm glad." She walked away a few minutes later, but Peaches could see the doubt forming. The question Angela would be asking herself later. If Peaches was struggling, why did she seem so steady? If she was going through a crisis, why was she here, networking and laughing and entirely unbothered? The cracks in Graham's story were already forming. Peaches had not said a single negative word about him. She had just shown up, been herself, and let the dissonance do the work. By the time she left the fundraiser that night, Peaches knew the whispers had started. People were comparing the woman Graham had described to the woman they had just seen, and the two did not match. Graham called her 16 times over the weekend. Peaches did not answer. She listened to the voicemails, though. each one a study in escalating desperation. The first few were apologetic. "Peaches, please, we need to talk. I'm sorry. Just come home." Then they shifted to frustration. "You can't just shut me out like this. This is childish. We're married. You owe me a conversation." And finally, anger. "Fine. If you want to throw away 3 years over nothing, that's on you. But don't expect me to wait around forever." Peaches saved every voicemail, added them to the folder. Evidence of his instability, his inability to take responsibility, his belief that he was the injured party. She did not respond, because Graham did not deserve her words yet. Not until she had decided exactly what she wanted to say and to whom. On Monday morning, Richard called her. Peaches almost did not answer, but something told her this was the moment, the opening she had been waiting for. She picked up. "Hello, Richard." His voice was careful, professional. "Peaches. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all," she said. There was a pause. "I wanted to check in. Graham mentioned that you two are having some difficulties. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." Peaches sat down, her hand steady on the phone. "That's kind of you. I appreciate it." Another pause. Richard was choosing his words carefully. "Look, I don't want to overstep, but Graham has been, well, he's been a little off lately, distracted, and some things are not adding up on the business side. I wanted to ask if you knew anything that might help me understand what's going on." And there it was. The door, opened just wide enough for Peaches to walk through. She took a breath. "Richard, can I ask you something?" "Do you trust me?" He did not hesitate. "Of course. Then I need to tell you something," Peaches said, "and I need you to hear me out before you respond." "Okay," Richard said slowly. Peaches told him. Not everything. Not the emotional devastation or the personal betrayal, but the facts, the affair, the timeline, the hotel bookings, the credit card charges that Graham had been billing as business expenses when they were personal trips with Courtney. She kept her voice calm, factual, as though she were presenting a grant application. She offered to send him documentation if he needed it. She made it clear that she was not asking him to take sides, but that he deserved to know the truth, especially if it affected the business. Richard was silent for a long moment after she finished. Then he said quietly, "I believe you." Peaches closed her eyes, relief washing over her. "Thank you. I'm going to need to verify some of this," Richard said. "Not because I doubt you, but because I have fiduciary responsibilities. If Graham has been misrepresenting expenses, that's a legal issue." "I understand," Peaches said. "I'll send you what I have." She heard him exhale. "I'm sorry, Peaches. I had no idea." "Neither did I," she said. "For a long time. But I do now." They spoke for a few more minutes, Richard asking careful questions, Peaches answering with the same precision she had brought to documenting everything. And when they hung up, Peaches sat back in her chair and felt the first real shift in power. Richard believed her, and Richard had access to the company finances. He could verify everything Peaches had told him. And once he did, Graham's professional reputation would be just as compromised as his personal one. Not because Peaches had destroyed it, but because Graham had. Peaches had just made it visible. Over the next week, the truth spread quietly through Graham's professional circle. Not through gossip, not through Peaches calling people and telling her side of the story, but through Richard, who did exactly what he said he would do. He audited the expenses. He cross-referenced the charges Graham had claimed as business costs with actual business activities. And he found discrepancies. Lots of them. Hotel rooms that had nothing to do with work. Dinners billed as client meetings that had never appeared on any calendar. Mileage reimbursements for trips Graham had never taken. It was not just an affair. It was financial dishonesty. And in a business partnership, that mattered. Richard confronted Graham privately. Peaches did not know the details of that conversation, but she knew the result. Graham's role in the company was restructured. He was still a partner technically, but his authority was reduced. His access to financial decisions was limited. Richard had lost trust in him, and in their industry, trust was everything. Word got out, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in the quiet, professional way that reputations shift. People started looking at Graham differently, questioning his judgment, reconsidering his character, And through it all, Peaches said nothing publicly. She did not need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Graham tried to control the damage. He called mutual friends, explained that Peaches was exaggerating, that she was hurt and lashing out, that the truth was more complicated than she was making it seem. But his explanations sounded hollow, because people had started to notice the inconsistencies themselves. The stories that did not quite line up, the defensiveness in his tone, the way his version of events kept shifting depending on who he was talking to. And then there was Peaches, calm, visible, unbothered. She went to her book club. She attended a work event. She showed up at a gallery opening that both she and Graham had been invited to. And when she saw him across the room, she did not hide, did not leave, did not make a scene. She simply stayed, present, dignified, whole. And people noticed. The breaking point came at that gallery opening. Peaches had not known Graham would be there. Or maybe she had suspected and decided to go anyway. Either way, when she walked in and saw him near the bar, talking to a couple they both knew, she did not turn around. She walked further into the gallery, admired the art, spoke with people she knew. She was not hiding. Graham saw her. Of course he did. And after 20 minutes of watching her from across the room, he approached. Peaches was standing in front of a large abstract painting, a glass of wine in her hand, when she felt him beside her. "We need to talk," Graham said, his voice low. Peaches did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the painting. "We don't." "Peaches, you're destroying my reputation," he said, and there was anger in his voice now, barely controlled. "You're telling people things that are not true." Now she looked at him. "Everything I've said is true, and I have documentation to prove it." His jaw tightened. "You're making this so much worse than it needs to be. If you would just listen to me, if you would let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Peaches said. "You had an affair. You lied. You used our money to fund it. You asked me to cover for you. And when I found out, you tried to make everyone think I was unstable so they would not believe me." Graham's voice rose slightly. "I never said you were unstable. You told people I was struggling," Peaches said. "You told them I was going through something. You planted the narrative, Graham. You know you did." People around them were starting to notice. The conversation was not loud, but the tension was palpable. Heads were turning. Graham seemed to realize this. He lowered his voice, stepped closer. "If you cared about me at all, you wouldn't be doing this. You would not be trying to ruin me." Peaches looked at him, this man she had loved, this man who still believed he was the victim, and felt something like pity. "I'm not trying to ruin you," she said quietly. "I'm telling the truth. If that ruins you, the problem isn't me." Graham's face flushed. His hands clenched at his sides. "You're vindictive. You're bitter. You can't handle the fact that I moved on." "Moved on," Peaches repeated, her voice still calm. "You were sleeping with someone else while we were married. That's not moving on. That's betrayal." Several people were openly watching now. The gallery had gone quieter. Graham realized it too late. He tried to recover, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Peaches, please. Let's talk about this somewhere private." "You're making a scene." Peaches shook her head slowly. "I'm not making a scene. I'm standing here, having a conversation. You're the one who's upset." Graham stared at her, and for the first time, Peaches saw something like fear in his eyes. Because he understood now. He had lost control. The narrative was no longer his. The people watching this exchange were not seeing a rational man dealing with an unstable wife. They were seeing a man unraveling while his wife remained perfectly composed. Graham turned and walked away, his exit just a little too fast, just a little too defensive. And Peaches stayed. She turned back to the painting, took a sip of her wine, and continued her evening as though nothing had happened. Within minutes, Jenna was at her side. "Are you okay?" Jenna asked quietly. Peaches nodded. "I'm fine." Jenna looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "You really are, aren't you?" Peaches smiled back. "Yeah, I really am." By the end of the evening, 3 different people had approached Peaches privately to tell her they believed her, to say they were sorry for not seeing it sooner, to offer support. The social gravity had shifted. Publicly, undeniably, Graham had tried to paint Peaches as the problem. But all he had done was reveal himself. Helen called Peaches 2 days later. Peaches almost did not answer. Graham's mother had never been kind to her, had never treated her as anything more than a disappointing addition to her son's life. But something made her pick up. "Peaches?" Helen said, and her voice was different. Quieter, less certain. "Hello, Helen." There was a pause. "I need to talk to you. Can we meet?" Peaches hesitated. She did not owe Helen anything. But curiosity won. All right. They met at a coffee shop, neutral territory. Helen looked older than Peaches remembered, or maybe just tired. She ordered tea and sat across from Peaches, her hands wrapped around the cup as though she needed the warmth. "Graham told me everything," Helen said finally. Peaches waited. About the affair, about the lies. Helen's voice was tight, controlled. He tried to explain it in a way that made sense, but it didn't. It doesn't. Peaches said nothing. She just let Helen talk. "I've been thinking about the things I said to you," Helen continued. "About how you needed to be more understanding, more patient, and I realize now that I was wrong." She looked up, meeting Peaches' eyes. "I'm sorry." Peaches had not expected this. She had expected defensiveness, justifications, maybe even blame, but not an apology. "Thank you," Peaches said quietly. Helen looked down at her tea. "I don't know what kind of mother I've been, that my son thought it was acceptable to treat you the way he did." She paused. "But I want you to know that I see it now, and I'm sorry I didn't see it before." They sat in silence for a moment. It was not forgiveness, not fully, but it was acknowledgement. And for Peaches, that mattered. A week later, Graham called, not angry this time. Defeated. "Can we meet?" he asked. To talk. Really talk. Peaches agreed. Not because she wanted reconciliation, but because she needed to set a boundary, clearly and finally. They met at a park, walking paths they used to walk together when they first started dating. The irony was not lost on Peaches. Graham tried one more time. "We can fix this," he said. "Go to counseling. Start over. I know I made mistakes, but we can work through it." Peaches stopped walking. She turned to face him. "Graham, you didn't just betray me with Courtney. You erased me from our marriage long before that." He started to protest, but she held up a hand. "You talked over me. You dismissed my work. You took credit for my achievements. You questioned my memory in front of other people to make yourself look patient and me look confused. You made me complicit in your lies. And when I found out the truth, you tried to convince everyone I was unstable so they wouldn't believe me." She took a breath, her voice steady. "You didn't just cheat. You spent 3 years making me smaller so you could feel bigger. And I'm not interested in being written back into a story you control." Graham's face crumpled. "I never meant to hurt you." Peaches looked at him, and she felt sad. Not for herself. For him? Because he genuinely believed that. He believed his intentions mattered more than his actions. "I know you didn't," she said. "But you did. And I'm done pretending it doesn't matter." She started walking again, back toward the parking lot. Graham followed, silent now, all his arguments exhausted. When they reached their cars, he tried one last time. "Do you ever think about what we could have been?" Peaches unlocked her door, paused, and looked back at him. "I think about who I am now. That's enough." She got in her car and drove away, and in her rearview mirror she saw Graham standing alone in the parking lot, watching her leave. For the first time in 3 years, Peaches did not look back. 6 months passed. Peaches signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning in March. The proceedings had been straightforward, relatively painless. No children, no contested assets. Just the quiet dissolution of a marriage that had stopped existing long before the paperwork made it official. She walked out of the lawyer's office into spring sunshine, and the air felt different. Lighter. Like she had been carrying something heavy for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. She went back to work. Not the part-time consulting she had been doing to accommodate Graham's schedule, but full-time grant writing. She took on projects she cared about. A housing initiative for veterans. A literacy program for immigrant families. A mental health clinic serving underserved communities. The work mattered. It had always mattered. But now Peaches had the space to let it matter fully, without apologizing for the hours it required or downplaying its significance to make someone else comfortable. Her colleagues noticed the change. Peaches was sharper now, more present, more willing to advocate for her ideas. She stopped hedging her opinions with qualifiers. She stopped making herself smaller in meetings. One of the organizations she had worked with for years nominated her for a professional award. The nomination letter cited her impact, her dedication, her ability to translate complex community needs into compelling narratives that secured funding. Peaches had not expected to win, but in late April, she received the call. She had been selected as the recipient of the annual Excellence in Grant Writing Award, recognizing her contributions to nonprofit funding in the region. The ceremony was held on a Saturday evening. Peaches wore a dress she had bought specifically for this, deep blue, elegant, something that made her feel like herself. She invited Jenna, who came and sat in the front row, beaming. When Peaches' name was called, she walked to the stage feeling something she had not felt in years. Pride. Not pride in being attached to someone successful, not pride in making someone else's life easier, but pride in her own work, her own accomplishments, her own voice. The presenter spoke about the grants Peaches had written, the programs she had helped fund, the communities she had served. They listed numbers, dollars raised, lives impacted, projects sustained, and through it all, they spoke her name. Peaches Coleman, not Graham's wife, not someone's partner, just Peaches, recognized for what she had built with her own hands, her own mind, her own words. She accepted the award and gave a brief speech. She thanked the organizations she had worked with, the communities she had served, the colleagues who had supported her. She did not mention the divorce. She did not mention Graham. This moment was not about him. It was about her, and that was enough. Afterward, at the reception, people approached her to congratulate her. Some she knew well. Others she had only worked with briefly. They told her they admired her work, her professionalism, her commitment. And Peaches realized something. She had been visible all along. Her work had always mattered. The people who valued substance over performance had always seen her. She had just spent 3 years listening to the one voice that told her she was not enough, and she had mistaken his voice for the truth. But it had never been the truth. It had only been his insecurity, his need to feel superior, his inability to value what he could not control. Peaches had always been enough. She had just forgotten. Now, standing in a room full of people who respected her, who knew her name, who celebrated her contributions, she remembered. Graham's presence in her life had diminished to almost nothing. She heard things occasionally through mutual acquaintances. He was still working in real estate, though his partnership with Richard had been restructured. He had a smaller role, less authority, a tarnished reputation that he was slowly trying to rebuild. He was not destroyed. Peaches had never wanted that. But he was facing the consequences of his choices. Professional, social, personal. And Peaches felt nothing about it. Not satisfaction, not pity, just a distant acknowledgement that his life was no longer her concern. She had moved into her own apartment, a small one-bedroom with good light and space for a desk where she could work. She decorated it exactly the way she wanted, bought furniture she liked, hung art that meant something to her. It was small, but it was hers, entirely, completely hers. Some nights she sat on her couch with a book and a cup of tea, and the silence felt peaceful instead of lonely. She was learning to be alone without being lonely, learning that her own company was enough. She was learning to listen to her own voice. The final encounter with Graham happened in May. They met to exchange the last of their shared belongings. A few books, some kitchen items, things that had been forgotten in the initial division of assets. They met at a coffee shop, neutral and public. Graham looked tired, older somehow, though only 6 months had passed. He handed her a box of her things, accepted the bag she had brought for him. "Thank you," he said. Peaches nodded. They stood there for a moment, the weight of 3 years and everything that had happened sitting between them. "Do you ever think about what we could have been?" Graham asked quietly. "If things had been different." Peaches looked at him. There was no anger left, no bitterness, just clarity. "I think about who I am now," she said. "That's enough." Graham nodded slowly, understanding that this was final. There would be no reconciliation, no what-ifs, no alternate version of their story where things worked out. This was the ending, and Peaches was at peace with it. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Graham said. Peaches almost smiled. "I already have." She walked away, and this time she did not feel sad. She did not feel like she was losing something. She felt like she was walking toward something. Toward herself. Toward a life where her voice mattered, where her needs were valid, where she did not have to disappear to make room for someone else. That evening, Peaches sat in her apartment, the box of belongings Graham had returned sitting unopened by the door. She would sort through it later. Right now, she just wanted to sit in the quiet and feel what she was feeling. Peace, wholeness, a sense of herself that was no longer contingent on someone else's approval. She thought about the past 3 years, the slow erosion of her voice, the 1,000 small moments when she had chosen silence over conflict, accommodation over authenticity. She thought about how much of herself she had given away, piece by piece, believing that was what love required. But love was not supposed to require invisibility. Love was not supposed to be the gradual negotiation of your own disappearance. Real love, the kind worth having, made space for both people. It did not demand that one person shrink so the other could expand. It did not require silence. It did not mistake compliance for compatibility. Peaches had learned that the hard way. But she had learned it, and she would never forget it again. She would never again mistake someone's need to control her for their love of her. She would never again edit herself to fit someone else's narrative. She would never again stay silent when silence meant erasing herself. Peaches had found her voice, and she was never giving it away again. She sat in her quiet apartment, the city lights visible through her window, and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. Not for reconciliation or redemption or a different past, but hope for the future, for the person she was becoming. For the life she was building, brick by brick, word by word, choice by choice. A life where she was visible, where she was heard, where she mattered. Not because someone else said so, but because she knew it herself. And that knowing, that bone-deep certainty of her own worth, was the victory. Not the divorce. Not Graham's consequences. Not the public vindication or the professional recognition. But this. The quiet, powerful knowledge that she was enough, that she had always been enough, that her voice, her truth, her presence in the world mattered, and no one could take that from her ever again. Peaches closed her eyes and breathed, in and out, steady, calm. Whole. She was free, and she was home. Peaches' story is not really about Graham's betrayal. It's about something quieter and more universal. The cost of silence, and the power of reclaiming your voice. For 3 years, Peaches believed that keeping the peace was the same as building a life. She thought that if she just stayed quiet enough, patient enough, understanding enough, love would somehow correct itself. But silence in the face of disrespect is not peace. It's erasure. And Peaches learned the hard way that when you make yourself smaller to avoid conflict, you don't just lose the argument. You lose yourself. Many of us have been taught that speaking up is aggressive, that setting boundaries is selfish, that demanding to be seen and heard is asking for too much. We've learned to translate our pain into language others can accept, to edit our truth until it fits the shape of what won't make waves. But here's what Peaches discovered. The people who benefit from your silence will never give you permission to speak. They will always find a reason why now isn't the right time, why your tone is the problem, why you're remembering things wrong. Your voice doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be true. Peaches' strength was not in revenge or rage. It was in her refusal to let someone else define her reality. Graham had spent years controlling the narrative, telling others who she was, what she thought, what their marriage meant. And the moment Peaches said no, here's what actually happened and here's the evidence, the power shifted. Not because she destroyed him, but because she stopped letting him write her story. If you're in a relationship, romantic, professional, familial, where you feel like you're disappearing, ask yourself this. Am I being quiet because I feel safe, or because I've learned that my voice doesn't matter? There's a difference between choosing peace and accepting erasure. You don't owe anyone your silence. Not to keep them comfortable. Not to avoid being called difficult. Not to preserve a version of love that only works if you stay small. Peaches didn't get her happy ending because Graham faced consequences. She got it because she finally stood in the center of her own life and said, I matter. My truth matters. And I will not be erased. That's the lesson. Your dignity is not negotiable. Your voice is not optional. And the people who truly love you will never ask you to disappear to make room for them. If Peaches' story resonated with you, you're not alone. And if you're still learning how to speak after years of silence, know this: it's never too late to reclaim your narrative. The truth, spoken clearly and without apology, has a gravity all its own. You just have to be brave enough to let it be heard. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop apologizing for taking up space. Stop editing yourself to fit someone else's comfort. Stop waiting for permission to speak your truth. Because your truth matters. Your experience matters. Your voice, even if it shakes, even if it's been silent for years, matters. Peaches spent 3 years making herself smaller. And when she finally chose to be seen, to be heard, to stand in her full truth without apology, everything changed. Not because the world suddenly became fair. Not because everyone believed her or supported her or validated her pain. But because she stopped needing external validation to know her own worth. She stopped letting someone else's voice be louder than her own. And that is the real victory. Not what others think of you, but what you know about yourself. That you are worthy. That you are enough. That your voice deserves to be heard. Not someday. Not when you've perfected your tone or waited for the right moment or gathered enough courage. Now. Today. In this moment. Your voice matters now. And the moment you truly believe that, the moment you stop asking for permission to exist fully in your own life, everything shifts. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just the steady, powerful knowledge that you will never again make yourself small for someone else's comfort. And that knowledge, that certainty, is freedom. Peaches found that freedom, not by destroying Graham, not by making him pay, but by simply refusing to let him control her story anymore. She spoke her truth. She backed it with evidence. She stayed calm, stayed dignified, stayed visible. And her truth was enough. Yours is too. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of voice and the cost of silence, subscribe to Silent Mind Stories. We share narratives about resilience, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your life. These aren't just stories. They're reminders that you're not alone and that your truth matters. Hit that subscribe button and let's continue exploring the emotional journeys that shape us. Because every story here is a mirror, and maybe, in one of them, you'll see yourself and remember your own power. Thank you for listening. Your voice matters. Don't forget that.